Welcome back, family, to Black House Live's book lecture series. We are discussing Dr. Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power. Today's lecture is on Chapter 6, Power and Personality. Again, I just want to recommend for folks that have not seen our previous lectures, where we've covered Chapters 1, 2, and 3 of the Blueprint of Black Power. We also did a lecture connecting Dr. Chancellor Williams' Destruction of Black Civilization to Dr. Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power. It is my argument that the Blueprint of Black Power picks up where Dr. Chancellor Williams leaves off, right, in the Destruction of Black Civilization. And so in our last lecture, we were discussing the ways in which Black culture, African-American culture has been socialized, right, for white American interests. This chapter focuses on the African personality, right? And we're going to be looking at similar ways in which the African personality has been socialized, right, for white American interests. And we're going to discuss what should and could be done about those things, right? Power and personality, according to Dr. Wilson, just as mature and competent members help to ensure a group's effectiveness and success, that personality weaknesses may disrupt and prevent a group's progress, right? And so weaknesses in the personality of individual members or weaknesses in the personality of Black groups, Black families, can serve as a major detriment, right, to the African-American community. And so members of organizations, businesses, and clubs with certain personality flaws can be the destruction of those programs. And so Dr. Amos Wilson is going to get us to psychologically analyze the Black culture. A group's possession of essential competencies and tendencies are vital to a group, especially when that group is under stress, according to Dr. Wilson, right? A loss of dedicated members with necessary personality and leadership skills can disrupt a group's effectiveness. We tended to see this in several social movements, right? When the charismatic leader of that organization, right, was assassinated, was imprisoned, or removed from the scenes, many of those organizations and movements were unable to continue with the positive momentum that it had established and developed. And so here, Dr. Wilson is reminding us that a loss of dedicated members with specific qualities and skills can be a major detriment to an organization's programs, right? This further speaks to the need of collective organization to prevent the weakening of organizations and businesses due to the loss of any individual personality, right? We want these Black organizations, we want Black businesses to be able to sustain their momentum, right? Regardless of loss of life, folks that are imprisoned for any number of circumstances and situations. So according to Dr. Wilson, a group's power potential is largely dependent on its abilities and characteristics of its members, right? And thus the power of a group reflects the power of the personality of its members. And so again, the power potential that the Black personality represents is a threat to the current status quo, to the current white economic status quo. And so Dr. Amos Wilson wants to remind us, right, that a culture, an organization or a business that has unique members with a unique set of qualities and skills, right, can dramatically improve the trajectory, right, of an organization, a business, institution, or club. Dr. Wilson argues that the collective personality of a group, society, or culture allows for the division of labor and other specialization. Depending on those skills and characteristics of a group member, it dictates the role that those members will serve in, right? So based on the personalities, the skills, and abilities of the individual members, it will dictate where we slot them in, right? In terms of available jobs and positions, right? We want to put the most qualified, the folks with the most expertise, we want to put them in the positions where they're going to be most useful, they're going to be most helpful, right? And you'll remember from some of our previous discussions, we talked about ethnic entrepreneurship. And so that will provide us the means to be able to hire our own folks, right, and put them in the positions that will be most effective for our political, economic, and cultural interests. Dr. Amos Wilson reminds us, right, that personality differences lead to a group acquiring new information, new skills that require adjusting to new conditions, right, which now requires new behaviors for new circumstances. Depending on what a group has been socialized for, right, depending on that socialization process, right, it is going to develop particular personalities of its members. And so if we have socialized the members of our organizations and our businesses, right, correctly and effectively, then they will develop the skills, they will develop the new personality, right, that will allow them to adjust to the circumstances at hand. They'll be ready to meet whatever objective is placed before them. Dr. Wilson then defines personality as a dynamic organization of traits, tendencies, abilities, intentions, and behaviors. Personality is an organized, right, set of traits, tendencies, abilities, intentions, and behaviors. Who has organized those traits? Who has organized those tendencies and intentions, right? For the last 2 chapters, we've been talking about the socialization process, and that socialization can come at the hand of the leadership of a particular group, right? It come from inside. That socialization can come from the outside as well. So Dr. Wilson argues that human behavior is coordinated. It's not random, and it's initiated by an organized brain and body. So the human body and brain organizes these traits and these qualities, right? To be more specific, though, right, in the current society in which we live in, it is the white power, the white elite power class that is able to socialize, right, all other subordinate classes, Black folks in this particular case, you're able to socialize and organize personalities and cultures to meet the economic and political and social cultural interests of white America, not for their individual selves. According to Dr. Wilson, a major way to control the power of a group is to control the collective organizational expressions of its members by controlling the contents, abilities, tendencies, interests, and tastes of said group. So quite clearly, what Dr. Wilson is saying, right, that one of the most effective ways, right, of controlling collective organization is to control the personalities of these individual members, or to control the collective group personality of these individual businesses and organizations. Dr. Wilson argues that individual and group Black attachment to white contents, white abilities, white tendencies and interests and tastes at birth is what allows this process to happen. That from birth, Black children have been identified with white interests, white values, white taste, right? Dr. Wilson states that in the same way that a child develops an attachment to its mother and has its personality organized to some degree by its mother, the same is true with the organization of the emerging and ongoing personality and motivational system of the individual. It functions not simply of its own independency, right, but functions in a way where it is responding to its socialization. It's responding to the way in which it's been organized. And so in the same way that children are going to respond to their mothers in a particular way due to its socialization, we as African people, we as Black people respond in a particular type of way based on the socialization that we've encountered. Dr. Wilson argues that the so-called unique personalities of the individual members of predominant social systems are nothing more than induced personalities that have been shaped by the predominant social system, right? And so the personalities that we currently have, that you see Black folks moving around and walking around with today, are personalities that were induced on them, right? Were given to them. They were socialized into these personalities. Dr. Wilson argues that in this case, personality is socializable. Similarly, in chapter 3, we were discussing the ways in which culture is socializable, and culture has been socialized, right? And it has produced these socially manufactured identities that we're currently walking around with today. Dr. Wilson is making an argument that the same thing applies to personality. The Black personality has been induced into in a particular type of way, right, that will meet and feed the economic, political, and cultural interests of White America. Dr. Wilson argues that the social powerlessness of Blacks is a result of white society imposing certain patterns and limitations on the Black personality and behavioral tendencies, right? Throughout history, Black folks were not allowed to read, they were not allowed to write. Black folks were not allowed to organize in the same ways. They were not allowed to politically dissent and disagree with the society in the same ways that other white folks were able to protest, right, and organize war, right, in their interests. And so this induced Black personality is compatible with maintaining the white controlled social system, which dominates Black people, right? Uh, Dr. Wilson is making the argument that the current induced Black personality serves an economic agenda for white America. The solution, or one of the solutions to this induced Black personality, according to Dr. Amos Wilson, is the personalities of Blacks have to be organized, right, by a Black controlled social system so that it is compatible. Dr. Wilson reminds us, right, that if our personalities are not socialized to be compatible with our own interests, we become, vehicles. We become instruments of control for our own people, right? If we are not serving our own interests, we're serving the interests of our oppressors, consciously or unconsciously. According to Dr. Wilson, political socialization is one of a variety of processes that are used by the white male elite to maintain their status, right? Maintain their status of control. According to Dr. Wilson, political socialization involves the conservative process of maintaining the status quo, getting the people to accept the system under which they exist, that it exists as it is, to accept the decisions of the powers that be without question. So according to Dr. Wilson, right, political socialization is about getting Black folks to accept the world that they live in and not to question it, right? The conservative process is to keep the status quo exactly the way that it is. Intergroup interactions, as defined by Dr. Wilson, right, are those interactions that happen between other groups. In chapter 3, we learned that an individual group can be socialized for a particular role to serve the interests of the dominant group. And Dr. Wilson teaches us in chapter 6 that a role is a pattern of expected behavior associated with a given position in society, right? And so based on the interactions between particular groups in society, we know that groups can be socialized for particular roles, right, to play particular roles. And Black people in particular, the Black personality has been conditioned and socialized, right, to play roles that are going to maintain the status quo in the way that it is. Wilson argues that through the process of intergroup interactions, the individual group internalizes a number of influential values, attitudes, and judgments from others. And he refers to this as the socialization process. In that early age, in the early stages of life, Black folks are made to identify with white symbols, white traditions, white values, white tastes, white behaviors. So much so that we end up believing that these things are our own unique personalities. And in chapter 3, we just got done discussing the ways in which socialization and the identification process, right, relates to the socialization of culture. And the Black culture has been socialized particularly, right, for white interests. And so now Dr. Amos Wilson is saying in chapter 6 here, right, that the African personality as well has been socialized. Black compliance, the myth of white legitimate authority over Blacks and its established maintenance reinforces the pattern of white domination and intergroup interaction over Black people, right? We uncritically accept and comply to white authority. We don't challenge this white authority. And by blindly being obedient servants, right, to this authority, we create a pattern that legitimizes these laws, that legitimize these rules, that legitimize this white racist behavior. And much like the myth of individualism that we just discussed in chapter 3, where the Black community is made to believe that they're free to exercise their ambitions and their talents to the fullest, right? And that, you know, arguments around discrimination and exploitation, right? Those arguments can no longer hold weight because the African is free to exercise their liberties however they see fit, right? Um, as a result of that, Wilson argued that the Black community ended up believing that their inadequacy was a byproduct of their own failure. Here, Wilson argues that white supremacy posits that whites relative to Blacks are autonomous agents who are free to set and order their own goals and priorities, right? But Dr. Wilson reminds us Blacks are by nature denied such autonomy and therefore are destined to act to achieve the goals set for them by whites rather than to act to achieve their own self-determined goals. We don't even know how to set our own economic realities, right? We don't even know how to set our own political, cultural, and social realities, right? Thus, we are an extension of white agency. We are the instruments and tools to ensure that white supremacy maintains the status quo. According to Dr. Wilson, the subordination of African Americans to European American authority requires the African American personality to be predisposed to be easily directed by others or outsiders than by itself from the inside. In order for Europeans to maintain the power that they have today, the African American personality had to be predisposed, right? It had to be weakened. It had to be made possible, right? For it to be controlled by outsiders more so than being controlled by its own indigenous controls. Wilson goes on to argue that in order for Blacks to more readily respond to the needs of white America, they must be other directed in their personality dispositions, right? They have to be more other directed than tradition directed or inner directed, right? And so by contrast, white folks have self-directed personalities. Here's the psychologist of Dr. Wilson that starts to come out, right? Where he now explains that in order for white power to exist in the way that it exists in the status quo today, is that the Black personality had to be induced and socialized in a way where Black folks are more concerned about other folks and the well-being of other people, more so than they are concerned about their own well-being. According to Dr. Wilson, the other directed personality is someone that is decreasingly reliant on their own consciousness and increasingly depends on other people for their ideas and actions. Because we have refused to reclaim our own identities, because we've refused to develop our own frameworks, our own vocabulary, right? Our own means of doing for self. We allow ourselves to be the tools and instruments to be utilized by our oppressors. According to Dr. Wilson, the tradition-directed personality is one that is obedient to the family. It adheres to the traditional ways of life. And traditional norms are the dominant guide for individual behaviors. Here, it is important to remember that in that socialization process, right, in the early stages of identification, the individual or the group becomes identified with the individual that is socializing it. So if we want our children to be more traditionally directed, right, and more traditionally oriented, then it is going to be incumbent upon us to socialize them in the early stages of what are the most important traditions, right, that we hold near and dear to us in our culture. According to Dr. Wilson, the inner directed personality is a byproduct of rules implanted in a child from birth. A mature inner directed adult has internalized general rules and norms in their early years that guide their behavior throughout their life. So as I just got done talking about this socialization process and the coming to identify at an early age oneself with its own indigenous values and symbols, right? Dr. Wilson says that this is what is needed in order to produce an inner directed personality. Dr. Wilson argues that African American powerlessness is largely a result of allowing their behavioral orientation and attentional focus to be manipulated and its political dispositions to be conditionally other directed by the white American community. We find ourselves today, ladies and gentlemen, in this powerlessness because of our lack of attention to creating our own ideologies, creating our own systems of values, right, and socializing our young people's personalities accordingly. By reclaiming our African-centered identity, by reclaiming our African-centered consciousness, right, we can then re-socialize our people. But until we do that, we end up continuing to be the social instrument, right, for Black control. So Dr. Wilson goes on to argue that African-American powerlessness can also be attributed to the African-American community's fear of striving for an Afrocentric reconstruction of itself, right, as well as its fear of a struggle to the death. We are a complex people, and it took years upon years to get Black folks into the situation that we are currently in, right? It is going to take just as much of a commitment, right, for African American people to see themselves liberated from this white domination as well. Dr. Amos Wilson argues that in order to re-socialize the African personality is going to require that African communities reconstruct their social psychological dispositions, founded, right, on an inner-directed African-centered self-knowledge, self-awareness, and identity. We have to look more inward. We talked about in the last lecture, the last chapter, and talking about what is the culture that we're going to have to create the reality that is going to destroy white supremacy. What is that world going to have to look like? What are the qualities and characteristics that we're going to need? What is the personality and the culture that we're going to need as Black people in order to destroy white supremacy? Other directedness in the reconstruction of the African personality. According to Dr. Wilson, the African American political economic personality is compatible with white American and European domination. And he makes this argument because he says we permit our consciousness and behavior to be manipulated by folks other than ourselves. We end up pandering and positing other folks' economic agendas. We go around touting other folks' political, social, and cultural ideologies and frameworks, and then question and wonder why we find ourselves in the same economic situation year after year after year, right? The African-American political personality has been aligned with the white American European interests. And what that means is that our behaviors are going to align with whatever behaviors are needed to ensure that white folks remain in a dominant position. That's what it means when we say that the African-American personality is compatible with white American European domination. Because in order for them to remain in the position that they are in, it means that we as Black people will have to, in some shape, form, or fashion, right, be in collusion with this. According to Dr. Wilson, the African-American personality was reconstructed once its original personality and identity was lost after enslavement. Just like we discussed in chapter 3, the current identities that we carry as Black people are socially manufactured identities. And that the socially manufactured identity of being an oppressed, poor Black person, that serves an economic and political agenda for white folks. Dr. Wilson is saying the same is true about our socialized African personalities. The African personality that we currently possess today was one that was reconstructed, was one that was made, right, during the enslavement of African people. And Wilson argues that this identity was and is one that was given by others. Why would the other give us this identity? Why would they need to give us this oppressed, right, type of personality? Because they recognize that our personality in its indigenous, wild form, right, was a threat to white European interests. And so Dr. Wilson argues that the other directed African personality is one that seeks approval and love of those who spitefully hate it above all life. The other directed personality wishes to be loved by the other. Wish to be loved by everybody else other than loving themselves. Dr. Wilson argues that the solution to the other directed African personality is the reclamation of the African identity by African people. We must reclaim the ways in which we see ourselves. We must create new eyes to see ourselves and force the world to see us with new eyes, right? There has to be a reclamation, right? The African-centered consciousness, the frameworks and the ideologies that we use meet the realities and the needs of African people. According to Dr. Wilson, the regression of African identity and consciousness is what we refer to as the alienation or self-alienation. Black folks have been alienated from themselves. Not only have we been alienated from the larger society and the larger culture, but Dr. Wilson argues that the African has been alienated from self. We do not know who we are. We don't know who we are in our indigenous, wild, native state. Right? We know who we are in this socialized, socially manufactured state. Right? Dr. Wilson argues that feelings like shame, guilt, anxiety, and fear are responses to the self-alienated internal rejection of the African identity. Because the African recognizes that she has been rejected by the larger dominant society, right? Because of its Blackness. It will refuse to associate itself with Blackness and other African people, right? So as not to feel those feelings of guilt and shame. So not to be reminded of those feelings of guilt and shame. Dr. Wilson argues that the attitudes of the self-alienated African are actually induced in them by white America. White America is the ones that make us feel guilty and ashamed for our Blackness. We talked in the previous chapter, chapter 3, how the religious institutions, the Black religious institutions, preaching this borrowed and forced theology, induced into Black Christians this idea of inferiority. And so the Black personality too has been socialized in a way as well that has induced this inferiority complex into the Black personality. Wilson reminds us that this social control works best when the self-alienated individual believes that they are working in their own interests and not truly for the interests of the powerful alien group. We were discussing in chapters 1 of What is Power, right? That the folks in power, one of the most creative means of them maintaining this power and holding on to this power is through its manipulation, through its influence, through its coercion. And it does this, right, without the subject group knowing that they're being manipulated and coerced. It's hard to defend yourself against a people when you don't know that they're doing something to you. It's hard to defend, right, when you don't know that you need to be defending. According to Dr. Wilson, white America benefits from the other directed, self-alienated, self-hating African-American personality. He labeled this section the socioeconomic functions of the maladaptive personality. There are economic benefits that the European receives, right, from this maladaptive personality of the African. He argues that European Americans benefit from the problems their social domination generates. Thus, they have an investment, right, a vested interest in perpetuating the systems resulting from these problems and interacting with African Americans in such a way that reinforces those symptoms and create new ones. If white folks can economically benefit from the trauma of African people, if white America can economically benefit from the psychological depression of Black people, then it is in their economic interest to continue to create the situations that create that psychological depression, that creates that trauma in the first place, because it impacts their bottom line in a positive way. The socioeconomic functions of the maladaptive African personality, given that European American domination creates social problems in the African American personality, it creates specific behavioral tendencies. Then the European Social Research Establishment studies these social problems, right, in African Americans to intentionally identify these behaviors as maladaptive, right? Which simply means that these folks can't adjust to the environment. They're not adjusting to the roles in which they've been socialized for. So they've been considered to be maladaptive. Wilson argues that this same establishment goes on to study how African Americans are specifically affected by these problems and tendencies and how they differ from Europeans. So then once we start to discuss the differences between Black folks and white folks, right, we use these maladaptive behaviors that we say distinguish whites from Blacks. And so it's not really, again, that the discrimination is not really the white supremacy, but that it is, quote unquote, these maladaptive behaviors that will explain these differences. According to Dr. Wilson, the solution for the African maladaptive personality is the rediscovery, the reclamation, and the integration into himself, consciousness, and identity. Again, we got to look more inwardly. Stop looking outside of ourselves for the solutions. Stop loving others more than we love ourselves. And Dr. Wilson argues that the true empowerment and liberation of African people can only come from ourselves. Right? It's only going to lie in the reclamation of our African identities and of an African-centered consciousness. Dr. Wilson uses Dr. Akoto's framework for an African-centered education. We'll be talking about an African-centered education, and some people just take for granted that they know what that means when we say African-centered education. But Dr. Wilson does not leave it up to chance. He doesn't leave it up to happenstance, right? That folks are just going to know what we mean by African-centered education. And so he presents an example, a framework that comes from Dr. Akoto. Dr. Wilson argues that Dr. Akoto is concerned, and the African-centered educational curriculum is most concerned with the origins, the current status and future of the African world. African-centered education is committed to correcting the historical distortions born of foreign invasions, destruction, enslavement, physical and mental colonialism, cultural disruption, and dependency. African-centered education is committed to rooting or anchoring the spiritual and the intellectual energies of African peoples in the spiritual, moral, and philosophical traditions of Africa. African-centered education is concerned to enable the African person with nation building, nation management, and nation maintenance abilities, right? If our African-centered education is not about teaching African people how to build, how to maintain and sustain their nation, their world, and realities around them, then what is the purpose of that curriculum? We're going to briefly review Dr. Akoto's The African-Centered Thematic Inventory, right? We're going to look at this in a brief overview, right, in the domains of this particular framework. And so included in this African-centered education, we will be discussing spirituality and what Akoto refers to as the psychoaffective, right? So this is termed spiritual awareness. The aim would be to transmit the knowledge of African spiritual traditions, develop an appreciation for tradition and the ability to apply the major principles to self, family, and community. One of the major reasons why there's a huge disconnect between African people and the modern European religions, right, is that the modern European religions fail to connect with the realities of African people and oppressed people, right? And so Dr. Wilson says that it would be the responsibility of our spiritually aware brothers and sisters and leaders to transmit the knowledge of African spiritual traditions that would allow African people to find unique and indigenous ways, right, of reconnecting with the spirit. The moral consciousness. Its aim is to foster an understanding and willingness to be guided by those principles that characterize the righteous and just person, right? So we need this moral consciousness that comes out of an African-centered framework. Remember, we talked about more religious systems that were used to induce these inferiority complexes in Black people, right? To explain and rationalize white supremacy. And so it would be the job of our morally conscious leaders to produce a rationale and justification for Black people to help us understand righteousness and just peoples. Family as basic spiritual and moral unit. Portions of this curriculum would aim to develop an understanding and appreciation for the dynamics affecting the African family, to recognize its centrality to the African nationality and work to revitalize, right? So family as basic spirit and moral unit, we're working to redevelop, reconstruct, right, and stabilize the Black family. Our units on self-knowledge practice to facilitate the achievement of total knowledge of self as a unique extension of the collective, defined by the collective and committed to it, right? So this is units that are specifically geared towards teaching folks about who they are, where they come from, who we are and what we are not. Ancestral veneration, to facilitate the acquisition and valuing of the wisdom of the ancestors, to foster a commitment to restore their works and make those works even better than before. We be seeing today in 2020, 2022 t-shirts and quotes that say, I'm not my ancestors, you can get these hands, right? And there's a large demographic in the young African-American community that somehow believe that they are more courageous and they are more fearless than our ancestors, right? But Dr. Amos Wilson just reminded us in the last chapter, in chapter 3, that we've lost the spirit of war. We've lost our war traditions, our martial traditions, our strategies of war organizing, right? Tactical fighting. We've lost a lot of that. And so to facilitate the acquisition and valuing of the wisdom of the ancestors, right, is to be able to tap into reclaiming the best of us, the best of our history, right? And a lot of that we have lost, reclaiming a lot of that which we have lost. The next unit would be cultural and ideological, right? So that first unit really focused on the spiritual, the psycho, affective. Here, the cultural and ideological. So the primacy of African civilization and the African origin of the human species, right? Dr. Amos Wilson and others have stated that power is getting getting other people to accept your definitions, right? Getting them to accept your frameworks. And so the cultural and ideological, right, is getting the world to accept our theories, our ideologies. We say that its aims is to develop and inform a complete and more comprehensive historical consciousness from antiquity to the contemporary that will be the basis for African unity and development. We want to provide African people, African children, African youth, African adolescents with the means of being able to discuss and talk about their history, right? To understand that the current economic situation that they're facing did not just happen in 2022. Right, that the current political situation that they find themselves in did not just develop in 2022, but that it is a historical accumulation of events that has happened that has gotten us to where we are today. And then African Heritage and Cultural Unit, right, its aim is to develop an appreciation of the needs to foster cultural and political unity among all African people and to commit oneself to that task. We need an ongoing educational awareness campaign that every day, every year makes important to young African people the importance of us united. We got to be committed to this for the rest of our days. The African-centered historical perspectives, right? African perspective on all knowledge and intellectual endeavor. What are our positions on the environment? What are our positions on new developing technology, right? And sciences, right? Its aim will be to develop a commitment to reconstruct African culture through the reclamation of African history and the critical creative analysis of all knowledge and experience from an African-centered perspective. We need Black analysts breaking down what law means for Black folks. We need Black analysts breaking down the economy and what that means for Black folks. We need Black spiritual leaders and spiritual analysts who can break down, right, the new research and the new data that's coming out of our Black think tanks, our African think tanks on these topics, right? Ideological clarity and commitment. Its aim would be to foster an identification with and a desire to participate in the ongoing dialogue aimed at creating a coherent and dynamic African nationalist ideology for the liberation and the independence of African people. We have to be about the work of creating the ideologies and the framework and the theories, right, that are going to help to liberate Black folk. We have to create the models, the chants, the songs. We have to write the books, create the lesson plans that are going to be used to help create the liberatory freedoms that we are looking to create for our people. Beauty and aesthetics. The aim of this unit will be to foster the development of a sense of the beautiful and righteousness that is African-centered, right? So we redefine beauty using African-centered metrics. White supremacy and racism. This unit will aim to develop awareness and sensitivity to the dynamics of white supremacy, to facilitate the development of personal and collective strategies to counteract the effects of racism and white supremacy, right? Somebody might say, what is the importance of teaching about white supremacy if our goal is to destroy it and to end it? We recognize that some of our young people may not intimately come to know white supremacy in the same ways that their mothers, their fathers, and ancestors did, right? And so it's going to be incumbent upon us to talk about white supremacy in a certain type of way that get young people to understand it as a threat, even though they may not have ever experienced it or experienced it in the same ways. And so these units will develop that awareness and develop that sensitivity around how to talk about white supremacy, and especially to our young people. The third unit, socio-political and economic, right? Or instead of, not the third unit, but it's more of a domain. So the first domain was of spirituality, second domain looked more at the cultural, ideological, right? And this third domain here is the socio-political and economic. All right. And so one of the first units of this domain is Pan-African political and economic unity, cooperation, and development. Its aim would be to instill commitment to developing Pan-African cultural, political, and economic unity and cooperation. The goal is collective African organization wherever African people are situated in the diaspora, right? And so we need these units to constantly keep at the forefront of our minds that we are a Pan-African people, right? And not just a nationalist people. African American nationality. This unit will aim to foster the commitment to the development of an organized, unified, productive, and dynamic nationality of Africans in America. Dr. Chancellor Williams in The Destruction of Black Civilization, as well as Amos Wilson here in Blueprint for Black Power, reminds Black people here in America that we are in a very unique position, and that Africans here in America, once organized, right, once organized for power, can serve as a supreme example to Africans all over the world, right? And so if Africans here in America are able to organize themselves as a nation within a nation here, it can serve as a supreme example for Africans throughout the world. National and community leadership. This unit would aim to develop an awareness of the necessary qualities of leadership, to include those necessary values and skills of leadership that are essential to the liberation and development of African people. Again, we recognize that leadership is not something that comes to fruition through osmosis, right? That at a certain age, a person just steps into leadership. We recognize that leadership is something that has to be developed, right? People have to be empowered into leadership. And so this unit would aim to do that work. Co-equality of men and women, equal responsibility and participation. This unit would aim to develop a sensitivity and commitment to eliminate any behaviors typical of sexism and sexual exploitation. We recognize that there is a tremendous amount of work that has to be done in this area to destroy the sexist pedagogy, right? To destroy the sexist environments that breed learning environments, hostile learning environments for women, as well as for young men. And so this unit would aim to develop that sensitivity and commitment around uprooting sexism wherever we find it. Democratic plurality of racial/ethnic nationalities in the American political economy. This unit will aim to foster a profound awareness of the psychic and constitutional entrenchment of the white racial ethnic supremacy in the US. We have to understand that white supremacy has stained every component of American society. There is no discipline, there is no nook or cranny that we can find in America that has not been touched by white supremacy, right? And so the aim of this unit would be to produce an awareness of the ways in which white supremacy has attacked the psyches, right, of all people in this country, as well as has been ingrained constitutionally into the values and the body politic of this very country. The next unit, human and civil rights, would aim to foster an awareness of one of the high goals of social activism, the creation of a world under that is culturally pluralistic and truly democratic, equalitarian, and just. All right. And so this unit will focus on the humanitarian activities and behaviors of a people that ensures that we bring that kind of world into existence, that we maintain it, and that we sustain it. Impediments. This unit aims to inculcate a clear understanding of the historical impediments to African liberation and development. What are the barriers? What has stood in the way of African folks finding and experiencing their liberation much sooner than 2022, right? And that once we acquire it, what are some potential impediments that stand in the way, right, of African folks being able to sustain their liberation and their freedom. Institutional goals. This unit aims to foster a clear understanding of our mission to build the institutional infrastructure of an independent nationality, to foster a conscious commitment to advance the African nation race toward independence and freedom, and the human race toward greater humanity. This unit will focus on the work that's needed to be done in order to not only build edifices and buildings, right, but to ensure the development, right, of practical objectives, practical goals, and action steps that members can make happen. 5 curricular domains. We looked at the first 3. So we talked about the spiritual, psychoaffective. We looked at the cultural, right? And we discussed the social, political, and economic. And again, we didn't even look at every aspect of those things, just a brief general overview. We discussed the political economy. We discussed some technology, right, of the social, political, and economic. But look here, of cognition, inquiry, mathematics, science, and computer sciences. Another domain would be technology, right? So mathematics, science, computer science, and functional skills. And the 5th domain would be nation building, right? It's practical application. So building a nation around developing careers and apprenticeships, research theory. These are our think tanks that we were discussing, community development projects, those beautification projects that we talked about, and the development of community infrastructure, and then the organizational experience, right? Whether that is on the national, local level or the international level, how are our Black businesses, Black institutions organizing themselves, mobilizing its members, all of the above. Another framework Dr. Amos Wilson provides us, other than Dr. Akoto's proposal for African-centered education, which he says is the best working model to help African people reclaim their God-given identities, right? Dr. Wilson references Dr. Colby Cambone's The African Personality in America, an African-centered framework, which he argues describes in detail the structure and basic traits of the prototypical African personality. And so if we need a framework around how to re-socialize the African personality, Dr. Cambone, his framework is one that we can use. Dr. Wilson argues that the acquisition of this personal orientation will permit African peoples to rid themselves forever of the Eurocentrically created other directed African personality, right? That's what I love about the Blueprint for Black Power is that Dr. Amos Wilson provides us with a ton of resources, right? He cites the sources of where he got his information from, right? And he points us in the direction. So we can use those sources too, right? And build off of them. So in summary, Dr. Wilson argues that the reclamation of the African identity and the construction of an Afrocentric consciousness by African people is crucial to the empowerment of their individual and Pan-African community. Such a reclamation of identity and transformation of consciousness would permit Africans to shed their other directed personalities and behavioral dispositions to greatly diminish their reactionary orientation to the world. Right? We have to shed these other directed personalities, right? Reclaim our African-centered consciousness, right? And reclaim our African identities, right? This is a way to counter the socialized Black personality, right? And the socialized Black culture. Thank you, brothers and sisters, for listening, attending this lecture here today on Chapter 3, the social and cultural origins of power. Until our next lecture, I look forward to your comments and your feedback. But until then, take care, family. Peace, peace.